the morning my son-in-law won $7 billion in the lottery. He was sitting at my kitchen table, eating the breakfast I cooked. He was wearing the jacket I bought him, driving the car my daughter and I helped pay for. And by that same evening, my daughter and I were standing on the curb, outside the house we had poured everything into, with nowhere to go. But here is what Marcus never counted on. I am 61 years old. I raised my daughter alone. I worked for 35 years as a bookkeeper. I have never in my life thrown away a single bank statement. Not one. And the lottery ticket that changed his life, he bought it with my debit card. My name is Patricia Holloway, and what I am about to tell you is not a story about a woman who got used and gave up. This is a story about what happens when you underestimate a mother who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Stay with me until the end. Because the moment my lawyer pulled up that bank statement, everything changed. For all of us. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I want to take you back to a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2018, because that is where this story really begins. Not on the day Marcus won, not on the day we were thrown out, but on an ordinary Tuesday, when my daughter Diana called me crying so hard, I could barely understand a single word she was saying. Diana was 31 years old at the time. She had her father's green eyes and my stubbornness, and she had married Marcus Belfield 3 years earlier in a small ceremony in my backyard in Raleigh, North Carolina. I had paid for the flowers myself, ordered them from a woman at my church, who did arrangements on the side, white roses and baby's breath, because Diana had always loved white roses ever since she was a little girl. I remember standing in that backyard watching my daughter walk toward the man she loved, and I thought to myself, this is enough. After everything, this is enough. I had raised Diana alone from the time she was 7 years old, after her father Raymond left us for reasons I still do not fully understand even today. And watching her start her own life felt like the finish line I had been running toward for 24 years. I thought the hard part was behind us. I was wrong about that in ways I cannot even begin to describe. When Diana called me that Tuesday morning, she told me that Marcus had lost his job at the logistics company, where he had worked for 2 years. She told me their landlord had already sent a notice. She told me they were 3 months behind on the car payment, and that their savings, what little they had managed to put together, was completely gone. She was crying the way she used to cry when she was small. That breathless gulping kind of crying where she could not quite get enough air between the sobs. And I did what any mother would do. I told her to stop worrying. I told her that we would figure it out together. I told her that she and Marcus and the kids, their 2 children, a 6-year-old boy named Caleb and a 4-year-old girl named Rose, were welcome to come stay with me for as long as they needed. I had a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Raleigh that I had owned for 18 years. It was nothing fancy, but it was paid down to the last $40,000, and it was mine. I had earned every square foot of it working 35 years as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized construction firm, getting up at 5:30 every morning, packing my own lunch, skipping vacations, driving the same car for 11 years, because I believed in building something solid rather than spending on things that disappear. I believed in that. I still believe in that. And I opened my home because I believed in my daughter. Marcus moved them in on a Saturday. He showed up with a rented truck and 2 of his friends, and I made everyone sandwiches and lemonade and tried to make the day feel like a fresh start rather than what it actually was, which was a family in crisis, taking shelter with a 61-year-old woman on a fixed income and a part-time bookkeeping contract that brought in roughly $2,000 a month. Marcus shook my hand at the door that evening after his friends left and looked me in the eye and said, Patricia, I want you to know I am going to make this right. I am going to find something, and we are not going to be a burden to you. I appreciated those words. I held on to them for a long time, maybe longer than I should have. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this story deserves honesty. Even then, even on that first day, there was a small, quiet voice somewhere in the back of my mind that I chose to ignore. It was the same voice that had whispered to me at the wedding 3 years earlier, when Marcus gave a toast that managed to mention himself 11 times, without once mentioning Diana. It was the same voice that had spoken up the first Christmas when he opened his gift from me, a new watch I had saved up for, glanced at the price tag on the box, and then set it aside without a word. I ignored that voice on moving-in day the same way I had ignored it before. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself that people under stress do not always show their best selves. I told myself that Marcus loved my daughter, and that was what mattered. But that voice, it never fully went away. The first month was manageable. Marcus spent his mornings on the computer, sending out applications. Or at least that was what he told us, and Diana handled the children and helped around the house. We had dinner together every evening, all 6 of us crowded around my kitchen table. And there were moments during those dinners that almost felt like something good. Little Caleb telling stories about kindergarten. Rose falling asleep in her chair before dessert. Diana laughing at something her son said. I cooked nearly every night. Pot roast, chicken and rice, spaghetti with homemade sauce, the kinds of meals that stretch and fill and make a small house feel warmer than it is. I did not mind the cooking. I have always found something steadying about feeding people. What I did mind, though I did not say so at first, was the way Marcus sat at the head of my table. It is a strange thing to notice, the way a man positions himself in a space that does not belong to him. But Marcus sat at the head of my table from the very first night, in the chair that had been mine for 18 years. And he carried himself with the ease of someone who believed he had always been meant to be there. Diana sat to his left. I sat wherever there was room. By the second month, the bills began to surface. Not all at once, not in a way that was immediately alarming, but steadily, the way water finds its way through a wall. The electric bill ran higher because there were 6 people in a house built for 2. The grocery bill doubled. Marcus's car needed a repair, $640, and he came to me on a Thursday evening and asked if I could cover it just until he landed something. I covered it. The following week it was Caleb's school supplies and a field trip fee. The week after that it was a copay for Rose's ear infection. Each individual expense was reasonable. Each individual ask was presented calmly, apologetically, always with the same phrase that I would come to hear so many times over the following years, that it began to sound less like a promise and more like a reflex. Just until I get back on my feet, Patricia. Just until things turn around. I kept a ledger because that is who I am. I am a bookkeeper. I record things. It is not a personality trait so much as a second nature built over 35 years of making sure numbers tell the truth. So I wrote down every dollar, not because I expected to be repaid, at least not at first. I wrote it down because writing things down is how I process the world. By the end of month 2, the ledger showed $4,260. I looked at that number one evening after everyone had gone to bed, and I sat with it for a long time in the quiet of my kitchen. Then I closed the notebook and told myself it was an investment in my family. And I meant it. What I did not know then, what I would not piece together until much later, was that while Marcus was supposedly sending out job applications every morning, he was also spending significant portions of his day doing something else entirely. According to Diana, who told me all of this afterward, Marcus had developed what she described as a serious interest in online sports betting sometime in the months before he lost his job. Not a casual interest, a consuming one. He had accounts on multiple platforms and had already lost several $1,000s before they moved into my house, which was part of the reason their savings had evaporated so quickly. Diana knew about it, but had minimized it in her own mind the way people in difficult situations sometimes minimize things that feel too large and too frightening to look at directly. She told herself it was a phase. She told herself that once he found work, the pressure would ease, and he would stop. She did not tell me any of this. I understand why she did not. She was ashamed, and she was also, I think, still trying to protect him, the way people protect the ones they love, even when those people are actively making things worse. Love is not always a clear-eyed thing. Sometimes it is the story you tell yourself, so that you can keep getting up in the morning. Month 3 brought the first serious conversation. I sat Marcus and Diana down at that kitchen table one Sunday afternoon, and I laid out the numbers. Not aggressively, not as an accusation, but the way I would present a budget report to a client. Here is what has come in. Here is what has gone out. Here is where we are. Marcus listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way I recognized, the way men sometimes look when they feel cornered by facts. Diana looked at the table. When I finished, Marcus said that he appreciated me keeping track, but that he was close, that he had 2 strong interviews lined up, that things were about to shift. I asked him to walk me through the interviews. He gave me vague answers, company names that I later looked up and could not find any record of online, job titles that did not quite match his background. I did not push. I wrote it in my own private notes, not the financial ledger, a separate small notebook I kept in the drawer next to my bed, and I wrote down the date and what he said and a single question mark next to each company name. I do not know exactly why I did that, instinct maybe, or 35 years of making sure the numbers and the story match up. By month 5, Marcus had not found work. He had, however, begun to develop opinions about the household, opinions about how the grocery shopping was done, which brands we bought, why I chose the stores I chose, opinions about the children's schedules, and how Diana managed her time, opinions about the noise level in the evenings and the temperature of the house, and whether the television in the living room was being used efficiently. He never said any of this to me directly. He said it to Diana, who relayed it with apologies and careful phrasing, as though she were a diplomat navigating a sensitive international situation, rather than a woman living in her mother's house, while her husband offered critiques of the grocery list. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to paint Diana as simply passive, because she was not. She pushed back. I heard her push back, through walls and closed doors, in the kind of low, urgent conversations that couples have when they are trying to argue without being overheard. But Marcus had a way of wearing people down. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He simply kept talking, kept reframing, kept returning to whatever position he had started from, until the other person ran out of energy to resist. I had seen that quality in people before, in difficult clients. In one particular manager I had worked under in the 90s, who had made 3 years of my professional life genuinely miserable. It is a particular kind of stubbornness that presents itself as reasonableness and is far more exhausting to deal with than open conflict. The summer of that first year brought 2 things I had not anticipated. The first was that Diana got a part-time job at a dental office 3 days a week. She was bright and organized, and they liked her immediately. And within 2 months, she was working 4 days. I cannot tell you how proud I was. Not because the income helped, though it did, but because I could see something returning to my daughter that I had watched quietly leave her over the previous years. A particular kind of uprightness. A way of moving through a room as though she believed she had a right to be in it. She came home from her first full week of work and hugged me in the kitchen and whispered, "Thank you, Mom," in a way that told me she was not only thanking me for the roof over her head. The second thing that happened that summer was that Marcus found a job. A warehouse supervisor position about 20 minutes outside Raleigh, decent pay, full benefits. He announced it at dinner, and everyone celebrated, and I felt, genuinely, a wave of relief so strong it almost made me lightheaded. I thought, here it is, here is the turning point. Here is where things get better. He started the job on a Monday. He quit off a Friday. Too much physical labor, he told Diana. Not what he was told it would be. He could not do that kind of work. He had a bad back. He never mentioned the bad back before, and he has not mentioned it since. But in that moment, it was the reason, and that was the end of that. I am going to pause here for a moment, because I want you to understand something about the psychology of what was happening in my house during this period, because I think it is important, and I think many of you watching this will recognize it, perhaps from your own lives, or from the lives of people you love. What Marcus was doing, whether he understood it consciously or not, was a process of incremental normalization. Each individual thing he did or failed to do was just barely within the range of what a reasonable person might excuse or explain away. He did not quit a job every week. He quit one job once, and there was a reason, and the reason was not entirely implausible. He did not ask for money every day. He asked occasionally, with appropriate embarrassment, with promises. He did not openly disrespect me in my own house. He simply made himself more and more at home in it, expanding into the space the way water expands to fill whatever container it occupies, until one day I looked around and realized that the house I had owned for 18 years felt less like mine than it felt like his. That process does not happen overnight. It happens so gradually that by the time you notice it, you have already accepted 100 small things that you never would have accepted if they had all been presented to you at once. This is how it works. And it is one of the reasons I want to tell this story in full, because I think the gradual nature of it is precisely what makes it so difficult to see from the inside. Month 8. Diana came to me one evening after the children were in bed and Mars was in the living room watching television, and she sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and she looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because it was the same expression she had worn as a teenager, when she had something to tell me that she was afraid would disappoint me. "Mom," she said, "I need to tell you something." She told me that Marcus had asked her to stop giving me her paycheck contribution toward the household expenses. He had told her that they needed to start saving their own money separately, building their own financial base, and that relying on a combined household fund was keeping them from developing independence. The way Diana explained it, it almost sounded reasonable, and I could see that she had been working to make it sound reasonable to herself as well. But I sat with that for a moment, because I am not a person who reacts before I think, and what I thought was this: Marcus had not worked in 8 months. Diana was contributing $400 a month toward groceries and utilities from her part-time income, and Marcus had decided that this should stop, not so that they could save together, but so that the money would sit in an account that he controlled, separate from the household where he was living for free. I looked at my daughter. I said, "Diana, whose idea was this really?" She looked at the table. I had my answer. I told Diana that I understood, and that I was not going to make her feel caught in the middle. I meant both of those things. I also went back to my ledger that night, and I updated every column, and I looked at the full picture, and I made a decision. I was going to give them one more year, not because I was a pushover, not because I did not see what was happening, but because I believed in Diana, and I believed that she was in a process of figuring something out about her own life, and that the best thing I could do for her was stay steady and stay present and make sure that when she was ready, she had somewhere solid to stand. I had been that somewhere solid for her entire life. I was not going to stop now, but I was going to be more careful. I called my bank, and I set up a secondary account that Marcus did not know about. I began moving a small amount into it each month. Not a dramatic amount, but enough to constitute a separate reserve that was entirely mine. I also made an appointment with my attorney, a woman named St. Graves, who had handled my will and the deed on my house, and I asked her to help me create a simple written agreement documenting the financial arrangement with Marcus and Diana. A loan agreement, not aggressive, not adversarial, just a clear accounting of what had been given, and an acknowledgement that it would be repaid. Sandra drafted it. I brought it home. Marcus refused to sign it. He said it felt like I did not trust them. Diana looked at the floor. I put the document in a folder, and I kept the folder, and I kept the ledger, and I kept the small notebook with my private notes, and I kept every single bank statement going back to the day they moved in. I kept all of it. Year 2 arrived like a long gray season. Marcus cycled through 3 more jobs in 12 months. A delivery driver position he left after 6 weeks, citing conflict with a manager. A customer service role he held for 4 months before the company downsized his department, which I verified was true, so that one was not his fault. And a brief stint doing sales for a company that turned out to be a multi-level marketing outfit, which cost more money than it made, and which he abandoned after Diana put her foot down, for one of the few times I witnessed her do so during that period. Through all of it, Diana kept her job at the dental office, was promoted to office coordinator, got a modest raise. She was the one keeping them financially afloat in any meaningful sense, and Marcus, to his credit, or perhaps to his strategy, never openly acknowledged this. He spoke constantly about what he was planning, about the business he was going to start, about the connections he was making, about the opportunity that was just around the corner. He spoke about these things with such conviction that there were moments, I will admit it, when I found myself half believing him. That is a quality he had. He could make a room feel like something was about to happen. He just never made anything actually happen. The children were growing. Caleb was 8 by the 2nd year, sharp and curious, the kind of boy who asks questions you have to actually think about to answer. Rose was 6, quieter, watchful, with her mother's green eyes, and a habit of sitting close to me when she sensed tension in the house, which was a habit I found both heartbreaking and quietly flattering. I loved those children. I want to be very clear about that because everything that comes later needs to be understood through that lens. I was not simply a landlord who happened to share a kitchen with these people. I was a grandmother in every way that mattered. I read to Rose every night before bed. I helped Caleb with his homework at the kitchen table. I went to school events and soccer games and class performances. I baked birthday cakes. I kept a drawer in the kitchen, stocked with the specific kind of fruit snacks that Rose liked and the particular brand of crackers that Caleb would eat without complaint. These were not obligations. They were joys, some of the genuine joys of that entire difficult period. And they were also, I understand now, part of what kept me from making the decision that I probably should have made sooner. Because how do you ask someone to leave when leaving means taking children away from the only stable home they have known? How do you protect yourself when protecting yourself means potentially hurting the people you love most in the world? I do not have a clean answer to that. I am not sure there is one. Midway through year 2, something shifted in Marcus that I noticed but could not immediately name. He became more confident, but not in the way that comes from accomplishment. More in the way that comes from something else, something that does not quite fit the surface story being told. He started spending more time on his phone in a separate room. He started making comments about money, not apologetic comments the way he used to make them, but speculative ones, the way someone talks when they think they might be about to come into some. He asked me once, casually over dinner, whether I had ever looked into investing, whether I had any money in the market, what my overall financial picture looked like. I told him I was comfortable. I did not give him numbers. He nodded and moved on, and I filed the conversation in my private notebook that night because it had the particular quality of a question that is really something else wearing a question's clothes. I called Sandra Graves the next week and made sure my accounts and my deed were all in order. Sandra told me everything looked fine. I thanked her. I went home and cooked dinner and helped Rose with a puzzle and sat in my kitchen after everyone was asleep and looked at the ceiling for a long time. It was Diana who first told me about the lottery tickets. Not as a confession, not as a warning, while as a passing comment one evening while she was washing dishes and I was drying them. The kind of side-by-side conversation that happens most naturally when your hands are occupied with something else. Marcus has been buying lottery tickets, she said, just about every day for the past few months. She said it the way you might mention that someone has taken up jogging. Not alarmed, not approving, just noting a fact. I asked how much he was spending. She said she was not sure, not a lot, a few dollars here and there. I asked if she was okay with it. She shrugged and said it was harmless, that it was the kind of small hope people hold on to, when bigger hopes feel too heavy to carry. I understood what she meant. I did not say anything else about it, but I noted the date in my small notebook, and I wrote, Marcus buying lottery tickets daily, amount unknown. And then I turned the page and moved on, because at that point, it felt like a footnote, not a chapter. I need to tell you about the morning of March 14th, 2022, because it is the morning that everything in this story lurches in a completely different direction, and I want to tell it to you exactly the way I experienced it. Not the cleaned-up version, not the version with hindsight built in, but the raw, confusing, disorienting version that was my actual reality on that actual day. I was in the kitchen at 7:15 in the morning, making coffee and packing Caleb's lunch when I heard Marcus in the living room make a sound I had never heard from him before. Not a word, not a sentence, just a sound. This short, sharp exhale that was somehow both a laugh and something larger than a laugh, something that had no language for itself. I walked to the doorway. He was sitting on my couch with his phone in both hands, and his face was the color of paper. Diana, he said, and his voice was almost nothing, barely a sound at all. Diana came out of the bedroom in her pajamas. What, she said, what is it? He held up the phone, she took it. She looked at it. She looked at him. She sat down on the couch, next to him very slowly the way people sit when their legs have stopped working properly. And they looked at each other. And then they both started making sounds that were somewhere between crying and laughing in that way that happens when an emotion is too large for any single expression to hold. I stood in the doorway of my own living room and watched my son-in-law and my daughter come to terms with the fact that the lottery ticket Marcus had purchased the day before, a Powerball ticket he had bought at a gas station 2 miles from our house, had matched all 6 numbers. The jackpot was $7 billion, spread over multiple winners, and Marcus's share after the split was $2.4 billion. I am going to let that number sit there for a moment because it sat in that room with us like a physical presence, like something with weight and temperature. $2.4 billion. I had spent the previous 4 years carefully tracking every $100 bill that had moved through my household. I had a separate savings account with $6,000 in it that I had built month by month as a private reserve. I owned a house with $40,000 left on the mortgage. My monthly income from my part-time bookkeeping work was roughly $2,000. And the man sitting on my couch, the man who had not held a steady job in 4 years, the man who had borrowed and spent and promised and cycled, had just won more money than I could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. I will not pretend to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because I am not sure I have the words for it. What I can tell you is that my first thought, before the shock, before the questions, before anything else, was a memory. It was a memory of sitting at my kitchen table 8 months earlier, looking at my financial ledger and making a decision to stay 1 more year. And I thought, maybe this is why. Maybe this is what I stayed for. The next few hours were chaotic in the specific way that unexpected, enormous good fortune creates chaos, which is to say everyone was running on a kind of electricity that had no clean outlet. Marcus was on the phone with the lottery office within 30 minutes, confirming the ticket, confirming the numbers, being told what to do next, and who to call, and what not to do in the meantime. Diana made coffee. She did not drink and sat at the kitchen table, cycling between crying and staring at nothing. I got the children ready for school, because someone had to, and because I think in moments of upheaval, my instinct is always to find the task that still needs doing, and do it. I walked Caleb to the bus stop, and on the way back I stood on the sidewalk outside my house for a moment, in the March morning air, and I looked at the front door, and I thought about the 4 years that had happened inside it, and I thought, now it changes. Now things get right. Marcus had borrowed, and I had given, and the ledger would finally be settled. Diana would be okay. The children would be okay. And maybe I would get to take that trip I had been putting off for 20 years, a week somewhere warm, somewhere I had never been. Just me and a beach, and no obligations. I let myself want that. I stood there on the sidewalk and I let myself want it. By that evening, there were lawyers in my living room. 2 of them, a man and a woman from a firm in downtown Raleigh that I had never heard of, both in dark suits, both carrying leather portfolios. Marcus had called them. He had called them that afternoon while I was at the grocery store. And by the time I got back, they were already set up at my dining room table, with papers spread out in neat rows. I set my grocery bags down in the kitchen and stood in the doorway, and I had the distinct feeling that I had walked into a meeting I had not been invited to. Diana saw my face and came over and touched my arm and said, "It is just to figure out the logistics, Mom. Just legal stuff. You know how complicated these things are." I nodded. One of the lawyers, the woman, introduced herself and shook my hand and said something about protecting the asset and structuring the distribution in a way that minimized tax exposure and maximized long-term security. She spoke quickly and used a lot of words that I understood individually, but that assembled themselves into a kind of wall when placed together in rapid succession. I asked if I could see the paperwork. She smiled and said there would be time for all of that. I went back to the kitchen and put away the groceries, and I wrote in my small notebook, "Lawyers here tonight. Marcus called them. I was not told." And then I made dinner for 6 people because it was 6 o'clock and the children were hungry. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Marcus was on his phone constantly, speaking in lowered voices in rooms I was not in. Diana was simultaneously thrilled and visibly uneasy in a way I recognized, that particular unease that comes when you can sense a distance opening between yourself and someone you love, and you do not yet know how wide it is going to get. She hugged me more than usual that week. She asked me twice if I was okay. Each time I told her I was fine, I asked her the same question back. Each time she said yes too quickly. On the 8th day, Marcus came to find me in the small home office, where I did my bookkeeping work. He knocked, which he did not usually do, and he sat down across from me, in the chair I kept for video calls with clients, and he folded his hands on the desk, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as carefully arranged. "Patricia," he said, "I want to talk to you about next steps. He told me that he and Diana had decided they wanted to buy a home, their own home, that this was an opportunity for them to finally have the independence they had always wanted, to give the children real stability, a yard, their own space. He said it with the same conviction he had always used when describing things that were about to happen. Only this time, the thing was already happening. He said they had been looking at properties and had found something they loved, a 6,000 square foot home in a gated community, 20 minutes outside Raleigh, with a pool and a guest house, and enough room for the children to grow. He said it would be a fresh start, a new chapter. He said those words, new chapter, and looked at me steadily. I looked back at him and I said, "Marcus, what about the money I have put into this household over the past 4 years?" He nodded. He had a number ready, which told me he had prepared for this conversation more carefully than its casual tone suggested. He told me they were prepared to give me $25,000 as a gesture of gratitude for my support. $25,000. My ledger at that point documented $218,000 in direct financial contributions, not counting the lost equity in my retirement account, or the 3 years of unpaid grandmothering, or the cost of my own reduced financial security. $25,000. I did not raise my voice. I said, "Marcus, I have documentation of over $200,000 in contributions to this household." He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, something flat and very still, and he said, "Patricia, you offered to help. Nobody asked you for anything. You made a choice, and we appreciated it, but we do not owe you for choices you made freely." Then he got up and left my office. I sat in my office chair for a long time after he left. I am not a person who panics. I am a person who sits still with difficult information until it arranges itself into something I can work with. So I sat, and I thought about everything very carefully. And then I opened my financial ledger on my computer, and I opened my bank statements folder, and I opened my small private notebook, and I began to build a timeline. Date by date, transaction by transaction, conversation by conversation. I laid it all out in a single document that was precise and organized, and completely devastating in its totality. $218,460. That was the number at the bottom of the page when I was done. Then, I did the thing that would turn out to matter more than any of it. I searched my bank statements for March 13th, 2022, the day before Marcus won, and there it was. A debit card transaction at the Quick Stop gas station on Garner Road at 2:47 in the afternoon. $43.18. Gasoline, presumably, and one Powerball lottery ticket. My debit card. My account. My money. I had given Marcus my debit card that week because Diana had asked me to. Because their joint account had a billing error they were trying to resolve, and they needed to be able to get gas without it becoming a whole thing. I had handed Marcus my card without thinking about it, the way you hand a family member your card because they are your family, and you do not think about it. But I had handed it to him, and he had used it to buy that ticket, and that ticket was worth $2.4 billion. I looked at that bank statement for a very long time. Then I picked up my phone and I called Sandra Graves. Sandra was quiet on the phone while I explained. She is the kind of lawyer who goes quiet when something is serious. Not distant, just focused. And her silence had a quality to it that I had learned over the years to read as her mind working very quickly through a large amount of information. When I finished, she said, "Patricia, I need you to bring me everything. Printed, organized by date. Every bank statement, every receipt, every piece of documentation you have." I said, "Sandra, I have been keeping records for 4 years." She said, "Good, bring all of it." I brought it. I drove to her office the next morning with 2 large accordion folders stuffed with paper. She spread it across her conference table and went through it methodically, page by page, while I sat across from her. An hour in, she looked up and said the debit card transactions is the key. In North Carolina, and in most jurisdictions in the United States, a lottery ticket purchased with someone else's funds, without their knowledge or consent, can be legally argued to belong to the person who provided those funds. It is not a simple case, and there is no guarantee, but there is a real argument here, and the documentation you have strengthens every aspect of it considerably. I asked her what she thought our chances were. She looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "I think Marcus Belfield made a very serious mistake when he decided you were someone he could dismiss. What happened over the following weeks was both more complicated and more straightforward than I expected. Sandra filed a civil complaint in Wake County Superior Court, asserting that the lottery ticket purchased on March 13, 2022, was bought with funds belonging to Patricia Holloway without her knowledge or consent, and that the winnings therefore constituted her property, or, in the alternative, that she was entitled to equitable compensation reflecting her documented financial contributions to the Belfield household. Marcus's legal team responded quickly, which suggested they had been anticipating something like this. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the debit card use was authorized and that Patricia had voluntarily gifted all financial contributions to the household. They were very confident in that motion. They had resources and they had numbers. And in these situations, resources and numbers are not nothing. But we had something they had underestimated. We had $218,000 of documented evidence that the financial relationship between Marcus and I was never characterized as gifts, either in writing or in the common understanding of both parties. We had the unsigned loan agreement Marcus had refused to sign, which Sandra argued demonstrated that both parties understood the money to be a loan, since you do not refuse to sign a gift agreement. We had text messages from Diana to me during that period that used the words borrow and pay back on multiple occasions. We had Marcus's own words in emails to Diana referencing needing to make things right with your mom. And we had the bank statement from March 13, 2022, with the transaction time-stamped to the minute. I want to tell you about Diana during this period, because I think her part of this story is as important as mine, and I do not want it to get lost. When Sandra filed the complaint, Marcus told Diana that I was being vindictive, that I was trying to destroy the family, that I was motivated by jealousy, and could not accept that they were finally going to have a better life than I did. He said these things with the same flat certainty he brought to everything. And I think part of Diana believed him, at least briefly, because that is what happens when you have been hearing someone's version of reality for long enough. She called me one evening about a week after the filing, and her voice had that careful quality that told me she had rehearsed what she was going to say. "Mom," she said, "do you really think this is the right way to handle this?" I asked her to tell me what the right way would be. She did not have an answer for that. I said, "Diana, I love you, and I love your children, and I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because what was done to me was wrong." She was quiet. Then she said, "I know, Mom, I know it was wrong." That was the conversation that mattered. Everything else was legal process. The mediation happened 6 weeks after the initial filing. Both sides in a conference room with a neutral mediator, lawyers on both sides, and Marcus and me sitting across a table from each other for the first time in an official capacity. He looked, to be honest, the same as he always had, composed, certain of himself. He glanced at me once when I came in, and then directed his attention entirely to his attorneys. I sat down, and I opened my accordion folder on the table in front of me, and I placed it with the sums facing him. And I did not look at him again either. We were there for 6 hours. The mediator was a compact, efficient woman named Judge Patricia Reeves, retired, who had the demeanor of someone who has heard every variety of human financial dispute and is no longer capable of being surprised by any of them. She moved through the material methodically. She asked questions in a neutral tone that, nonetheless, had edges to it when she needed them to. At one point, midway through the afternoon, she looked at Marcus's attorneys and said, "So your position is that your client borrowed the use of this woman's home and her financial resources for 4 years, during which time she documented over $200,000 in contributions, and that none of this created any legal obligation." Marcus's lead attorney said that was essentially correct. Judge Reeves looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her notes. Then she said, "And the debit card transaction on March 13th. How does your client characterize that?" There was a pause. Marcus's attorney said that the use of the card was authorized. Judge Reeves said, "Authorized by whom?" The attorney said, "By common household practice." She looked at him for another moment, and then she wrote something down and moved on. The settlement was reached at 5:40 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I am not going to give you the exact number, because some of that is still bound by a confidentiality agreement that Sandra advised me to maintain. What I will tell you is this. It was not $25,000, was not a guest house. It was a number that Sandra, called fair and meaningful, and that I called the first real breath I had taken in 4 years. Marcus signed without looking at me. His attorneys gathered their materials and left quickly. Sandra and I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had gone, and she poured us both a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, and we sat quietly for a moment. "I want you to know," Sandra said, "that in 30 years of practice, the level of documentation you brought to this case is the reason it resolved the way it did. Judges and mediators respond to paper trails. They respond to people who wrote things down." I looked at the window. I thought about every evening I had spent at my kitchen table with my ledger and my notebooks while the rest of the house slept. I thought about the bookkeeping instinct that I had sometimes thought of as a quirk, as a slightly obsessive habit, as the particular way my particular brain processed an uncertain world. It had not been a quirk. It had been 35 years of professional discipline that I had applied to my own life without quite knowing that I would one day need it the way I needed it then. Diana filed for divorce from Marcus 4 months after the settlement. I did not ask her to, and I did not encourage her to. And when she told me she was doing it, I sat across from her at my kitchen table, the same table where so much of this story had taken place, and I held her hands and I let her talk. She told me things about those 4 years that I had suspected but not known. She told me about the arguments she had not let me hear, the ways Marcus had spoken to her in private, the slow and careful work he had done to make her feel smaller and less capable than she was. She told me about the night after the lottery win, when he had told her that she needed to understand that money changes dynamics, and that she should think carefully about what role she wanted to play going forward, as though she were an employee being offered a restructured contract, rather than a wife of 7 years. She had not left him then, she said, because she was afraid of what leaving would mean. Afraid of the logistics, afraid of the children, afraid, I think, of finally admitting to herself what she had been quietly knowing for a long time. The settlement, she told me, was what gave her the ground to stand on. The moment she saw that there was a documented record of what had happened, that the story was not just a feeling but a fact, something shifted for her. She said, "Mom, you always told me to write things down. I never understood why until now. I am going to tell you where things stand today, because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the resolution, but the reality of what comes after." Marcus contested the divorce, which surprised no one, and the process took 14-month months that I helped Diana with, because I was in a position to help her now, and because I will always be in a position to help my daughter when I can. He has since relocated to another state. The children see him on a schedule that the court set, and that Diana manages with the kind of quiet competence that I knew she always had in her. Caleb is 10 now, and building model rockets in my garage on weekends. Rose is 8, and reads everything she can get her hands on and has decided she wants to be a veterinarian, which I fully support. Diana is working full-time now, has been promoted again, and is taking a business administration course at the community college, 2 evenings a week. She sits at my kitchen table sometimes in the evenings doing her coursework, and I sit across from her doing mine, because I have gone back to doing occasional consulting work for small businesses, which I find I like more than I expected. My house, the same house I have owned for 22 years now, feels like mine again. That is a sentence I could not have written 3 years ago. It feels like mine. The rooms have the particular quiet of a home that belongs to the people living in it, rather than simply containing them. I get asked sometimes, by people who know the story, whether I regret it, whether I would have done anything differently if I could go back to that phone call in the spring of 2018, Diana crying, Marcus out of work, the family in trouble. I have thought about this carefully and honestly, and here is where I land. I do not regret helping my daughter. I would help her again. The help was real, and it was given from a real place, and it mattered to those children in ways that I believe were genuine and lasting. What I would do differently is simple. I would draw the line sooner. I would put the loan agreement on the table in month 1, not month 3, and I would not accept a refusal to sign it as an answer. I would trust the small, quiet voice that spoke to me on moving-in day and at the wedding, and in every room where Marcus was not quite what the surface suggested. I would remember that love and documentation are not opposites, that caring for the people in your life and keeping clear records of your arrangements with those people are not contradictory impulses. That in fact, if you love someone, one of the most loving things you can do is be honest about the terms of your shared life, rather than letting ambiguity build up until it becomes a wall that no one can see over. I have told Diana this. She writes everything down now. We both do. There is one more thing I want to say, and then I will let this story rest. On the day the settlement was finalized and I drove home from Sandra's office, with the paperwork in the accordion folder, on the passenger seat, I stopped at a travel agency on the way. An actual physical travel agency, which still exists, I am happy to report, though there are fewer of them than there used to be. I walked in, and I sat down across from a very patient woman named Carol, and I told her I wanted to go somewhere warm, somewhere I had never been, somewhere with a beach. She showed me options, and I picked one, and I put a deposit down on the spot. I went to Belize in October of that year. I stayed for 10 days. I sat on a beach every morning, with coffee and a book, and I watched the water, and I thought about nothing in particular, and everything in general. On the third day, sitting there in the early morning quiet, I started to cry. Not from sadness. From something I can only describe as the physical release of an enormous amount of weight. Weight I had been carrying for so long that I had begun to forget it was there, that had simply become the baseline feeling of being me. I sat on that beach and I cried until I was done. And then I opened my book and I read, and the water moved, and the morning got warmer, and I was 61 years old, and I had won. Not because of the settlement, not because of the lawyers, or the ledger, or the debit card transaction, time-stamped to the minute. I had won because I had told the truth, kept the records, held the line, and refused to let someone else's version of events become the only story in the room. That is the only kind of winning that, actually.